Okay, we'll go ahead and get ready to start here. I tried to adjust that clock this morning because we were running almost 5 minutes slow, but now we're running a couple minutes fast. So it doesn't seem to be able to hold its spot, but maybe it'll work better for Pat Nod than it did for me. So I just changed the battery. It's a new battery. Yeah, it's actually running a little fast now. So or maybe it just loses its set. We are still in John chapter 6. We will finish. The intention is to finish chapters 5 and 6 today. We'll take a look at the end of chapter 6 first, and then we're going to take a look back over 5 and 6 just to sort of remind ourselves of where we've been, because as we were working our way through 5 and 6, both of them are difficult texts, and we spent quite a bit of time tearing them apart. Now we have to kind of put them back together and say, okay, what do they mean in the context of where Jesus is in his the development of his ministry and his mission. So today we're going to start by looking at chapter 6, verses 60 through 71. And in this section, we will see the reactions to this most recent teaching of Jesus, the teaching about Jesus being the bread of life. Okay, and that's where we're going to start this morning. The reactions that he receives are described in two separate groups. First of all, in the first 7 verses 60 through 66, we see just a description of what happens amongst the generic disciples, those who were following Jesus but didn't have the special calling. But then from verses 67 on, Jesus drills down and talks to the 12 about their reaction. Okay, so the first part of this is to the disciples at large, and then the second part of this is to the 12 specifically. So that's where we will see. So let's start with the larger group and look at their reaction to what Jesus has just said. And this is verses 60 through 66. On hearing these things, many of his disciples said, "This is a hard teaching. Who can accept it?" Aware that his disciples were grumbling about this, Jesus said to them, "Does this offend you? What if you see the Son of Man ascend to where he was before? The Spirit gives life, the flesh counts for nothing. The words I have spoken to you are spirit, and they are life. And yet there are some of you who do not believe." For Jesus had known from the beginning which of them did not believe and who would betray him. He went on to say, "This is why I told you that no one can come to me unless the Father has enabled him." And from this time on, many of his disciples turned back and no longer followed him. Okay? And so Jesus now talks to this group that's described as a group of disciples in verse 60. This is not the Jews that we saw back in verse 41, where the text tells us the Jews began to grumble about him because he said, "I'm the bread that came down from heaven." And it's also not the Jews of verse 52, where the Jews began to argue sharply amongst themselves. This was a group who had arrived at some level of discipleship. This was a group who had believed in Jesus, at least superficially. But what's happening to them now is they're finding it difficult to continue. And there's doubt creeping into their minds because of the things that Jesus has said. Now, in order to understand that doubt and where that doubt's coming from, let's just sort of remind ourselves where these people have been in the last few days. First of all, they were miraculously fed by Jesus out in the wilderness. And with that feeding, they began to have visions of the Messianic kingdom being fulfilled and coming into existence. But in the midst of this, while they are ready to anoint Jesus king, in fact, in spite of that, Jesus walks away and leaves and goes off to be by himself. And now he's been teaching things that make little sense to them in chapter 6. And the text tells us that some of these teachings were especially hard. What do you think was particularly difficult amongst the teachings that Jesus had just given them? From this, see, I'm trying to see if you learned anything the past few weeks. Eating his flesh and drinking his blood, yes. I mean, there's visions of cannibalism coming up. There's visions of breaking the Old Testament law, which forbade the ingestion of blood. Okay, and so, you know, what is he talking about here? This is a tough teaching. How can we do that? We're good Jews. We're trying to be good Jews, and he's teaching the wrong thing. So there's one thought is that, you know, Jesus has said, you have to participate with me by literally eating my flesh and drinking my blood. And of course, we've talked at length about that, meaning primarily participating with Jesus and believing in him, ingesting him into our lives so that we become more like him. That's right. But in addition to that, Jesus has said something else that's troubling to them, and that's back in verse 51. Where Jesus said, I will give my life for the world. Okay, and so as Jesus begins to talk about his death, what are these people thinking? Well, how can he be a Messiah if his intention is to come here and die? That makes no sense to me. If he's going to be a king, he has to live and create his kingdom and then administer it. And so how can this be? How can this possibly be? And so these are challenging ideas for these people who have many preconceived notions about what this kingdom was going to be and what it would be looking like. And so according to verse 61, they're grumbling about it, and Jesus responds, they're being offended by it. They've been upset by what he has said. This is not just a casual, well, I don't think I can accept what he's teaching, I'll go this way. They're upset about it because their lives, they had trusted in him to the point that they went out to see him on this occasion, or they diverted their trek towards Jerusalem. They diverted so that they could experience his teaching and things. And so they're quite upset about it. And Jesus says, does this offend you? And then Jesus has the courage, the audacity to drive deeper. Because he says, okay, if this offends you, just wait. Because that's what he says. What if you see the Son of Man ascend to where he was before? Now, what is the scenario that Jesus is describing now that's going to even be more difficult for them?
They're God. That he's God.
That he's God. That he's going to leave them. Yeah. He's going to leave them for good. Okay, what you think this offends you as I'm talking about these things? What about when everything goes back to the way it used to be? When I'm with the Father in heaven? How are you going to react to that, disciples? And that's what Jesus is saying in the first part of 52. What if you see the Son of Man ascend to where he was before? What if that happens? How are you going to hold on at that point? Okay? And then he gives the key. The key is verse 53. And this is the piece that unlocks this for us. In verse 60, did I say 53? I meant to say 63, I'm sorry. This little print gets to me sometimes. 63, he says, the Spirit gives life, the flesh counts for nothing. What he's saying here is that my physical presence with you is not the important thing. The important thing is that you see the spiritual reality that's going on. And this is what we've been talking about all the way through the Gospel of John. We are to see the physical things, but they are pointing to spiritual things that we need to recognize behind that and through that. And that's what Jesus says now. He says, the Spirit gives life, the flesh counts for nothing. The words I have spoken to you are spirit In other words, the teachings that I am giving you are the important thing. Those are the things that will last with you. This flesh and blood will not. But these words will last, and those are the things that will change your lives and infuse you with the knowledge and the courage that you are going to need to become eventually the pillars of the church in the first century and take the gospel to the entire world. And so that is the key that Jesus is getting at here. So read that one more time and see how it fits together. The Spirit gives life, the teachings he's offering. The flesh counts for nothing. His presence with them is not really that important. The words I have spoken to you are the Spirit, and they are life. That is the thing that's important, is listen to his teaching. Listen to what he's saying. And then in verse 64, Jesus tells us that, or we understand from verse 64, that Jesus had always known which ones were believing and which ones were not. So he was well aware that some of their faith was inadequate. He was well aware of that. But this is setting up for us in this section of text, it's setting us up for a climax, because he's going to climax this section by talking directly to Judas about his faith and his lack of faith. And he's going to kind of tell Judas where he's headed, even if Judas wasn't even aware of it himself at this point. Okay? And so we see that. Now, verse 65, this is a theme we've hit on many times already through the gospel, and that is talking about the two sides of the salvation process. That people, that God, first of all, has called us into a relationship, but then humans have to reciprocate and understand and accept and cling to that relationship as well. So it's refreshing our minds about that two sides of the salvation process. Then we get to the critical verse for this section, verse 66, where the text tells us, from this time, many of his disciples then turned back and no longer followed him. The phrase from then on, or from this time, may be translated also for this reason, or for that reason. Okay, and so it's because of their lack of understanding of what Jesus is doing and what he's saying. Once again, their inability to see, it's because of those things that they turn back now and leave the group, quit following him. And so remember that what we're seeing in chapters 5 and 6 is this polarization. People are being split into two groups. There's a group of believers who keep getting stronger and stronger in their belief, and there's a group of unbelievers who are getting farther and farther away from belief. Okay? And that's what we're seeing happen throughout chapters 5 and 6. Now, we drill down in the rest of this chapter and we see the same thing happening even inside the 12. Okay? And we see that some are growing in their faith and some are headed in the wrong direction, at least one. Verse 67, you do not want to leave it too, do you? Jesus asked the 12. Simon Peter answered him, Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. We believe and know that you are the Holy One of God. And then Jesus replied, have I not chosen you, the 12? And yet one of you is a devil. And he meant Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, who, though one of the 12, was later to betray him. Verse 67, Jesus challenges the 12. Okay, you've seen all these others. Where are you? Where do you stand? And Jesus now is beginning to focus more directly on those who will carry the responsibility forward when he is no longer present, right? And we're going to see this through the gospel. As we get to like chapter 13 especially, by that point we have focused in on the 12 almost exclusively. other than the actual events of the crucifixion, from chapter 13 through chapter 21. We're looking really just at the 12. And that's what's happening as John works his way through this narrative. He's focusing more and more on those disciples and less concerned about what's happening on the grand scheme. So this is what's happening here is sort of a picture of what's coming. Okay? It's foreshadowing what we're going to see later on. Verses 68 and 69, we see Peter's response. And boy, isn't he just always the one who sometimes he gets it right and sometimes he doesn't. But you always know where he's at, right? And in this case, he gets it right. And what Peter does here is this is a direct parallel to Peter's confession as it's recorded in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It's in different terms. We don't even know if it was the same occasion, but it's the same type of understanding what Jesus is trying to get across. Remember back in Matthew chapter 16 when Jesus asked, "Who are people saying that I am? Some say you're Elijah, some say you're the prophet, but who do you say I am?" And Peter said, "You're the Christ. You're the Son of the living God." Okay, and Peter was able to begin to put the pieces together. And we see that again here. Take a look at what he says specifically. "Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life." Peter understood what Jesus was saying back in verse 63. When he said the Spirit counts for everything. It's all about the spiritual side of this. It's about what I'm teaching you, not about me physically being here in a body. It's about what I'm teaching you. And Peter says, you have those words. You have those words that bring life. And so Peter, once again, is ahead of the curve. And he's seeing exactly what Jesus is saying. But the other thing I want you to see about what Peter's saying is notice how radical his statement is. He says, there is no other place to go. I can't go back to my old life anymore. I can't just walk away from this. You are the only place. You have the only answers. You have the only words, Lord. And that's what Peter's saying. He is in a radical place. He can't just walk back and become a fisherman anymore. When he says this, he says, to whom shall we go? I have no other place. I have no other place to go because you are it. You are my life. And that's what Peter's saying in this. It's a remarkable statement that he makes. And it's a profession of where he is as an individual and in his faith walk and faith development.
Peter always was the one to speak up.
Mm-hmm.
But I wonder if what Peter is saying and thinking represents the thinking of all of them or just Peter. You know,
Well,
it's kind of hard to tell.
It's kind of hard to tell, but at least John is pointing out that in Peter's statement, there's something important for all of them and important for us to see because it's recorded, because it makes the text, because it's here for us. Okay? So yeah, often, and I tend to think that too, I think Peter is speaking for the group as a whole. Not every person in the group, but the group as a whole. Sorry?
Where shall we go?
Where, yeah. Yeah, to whom shall we go? We have done this. Good point, Ron. Yeah, he uses the plural.
They left their lives.
Yeah, they are committed to this now. And remember, we're going to get into this more, but this is following Passover. Jesus has one more year. He's going to be gone a year from now. Okay? He has one more year. I kind of wonder how anxious Jesus is getting about it all. I mean, he knows what's going to happen, but nonetheless, he knows that there's a lot of maturing that needs to happen in these guys. He's got 1 year left. Okay. Well, let's see. Where am I now? Verse 69, Jesus uses the perfect tense. We talked about that a little bit last week, where the perfect tense is something we see in Greek, and it indicates that it's an action that's continuing. So when it says, we believe and know that you are the Holy One of God, really it says we are believing and continue to be convinced. So it's not something that we believed in the past. It's not something that I'm just saying for today. It's something that's been growing all along. This belief and this conviction has been growing. And you can see that in the Greek where you cannot see it in the English. Question for you. When you see Peter making this kind of a statement, is that a kind of statement that you would make or that I would make? Where else can I go? Where else can I turn? It's an important question, isn't it?
Aaron, it also points to the fact that our lives should mimic this as far as the perfect goals for us, that we should be growing into a greater relationship.
That's right.
Instead of walk through the door and say, okay, I'm here now.
That's right. The point is made that as we read these things, and remember, the whole gospel is about us developing faith, right? And so we need to identify with these people and these stages that they go through. And one of the important lessons is faith is not something that you just get hit over the head one day and it's there. Not for most. For most, it's a gradual, stepwise process. But it begins in these places and in these types of statements. Verses 70 and 71 remind us, though, that even amongst the 12, even amongst those that Jesus himself had chosen, Satan was at work. And there's one whose faith is not going to survive. And so it's fascinating that Jesus makes this statement with Judas right there. Like I said earlier, I'm not sure if Judas himself knew at this point where he was at, but I am guessing that Judas is facing some of those inner questions that others are facing. You know, we don't know a whole lot about Judas's motivation for following Jesus, other than he could get his hands into the money, apparently. But aside from that, we don't know a lot about it. Was he one of those who now is becoming disappointed, maybe even disgusted with Jesus because he's invested a year or two because Judas has now invested a year or two following him, and this doesn't look like it's going anywhere? Maybe Judas is one of those who's also already feeling the doubt and being turned off. We don't know. We can't see inside Judas's heart. But it's interesting also to see the wording that comes up in verse 70, where Jesus says, I chose you, but yet one of you has been chosen by somebody else, the devil. He is a devil. One of you is a devil. And so there's directly this conflict, and that enlarges to be the conflict that everybody is reacting to in this section. All of those disciples who have chosen to leave are similarly responding to the devil's call and the devil's seeding of doubt. Remember that Satan is the great deceiver. And all he has to do is create doubt. He doesn't have to create falsehood. He just has to create doubt. That's all it takes to get in the way of faith. As we close this chapter then, in the grand scheme of the book of John, we can also see that John is setting up, and he has already arrived at the conclusion that Jesus is going to die. Already here. We've still got a year to walk with Jesus. But the cards have already been laid on the table because Judas's plot is already, even though it may not have hatched in Judas's mind, it's set because of Satan's call. So the fact is that the devil is having his effect. Even Jesus is unable to hold on to all the 12 that he has called. And the fact that Jesus needs to go to that cross is cemented and just made apparent and obvious. There is no other alternative. So the plan is cast. The direction to Jerusalem and Golgotha is ahead, and that's where John is leading us as he gives us this recollection of these events.
It's a little bit, for me, not confusing, but I'm just surprised that they didn't grab hold of that statement a little bit harder and say, who is it now? Later they did, at the time of betrayal, but this is a year before, and they really didn't make a big deal of it.
They don't seem to,
No.
but it's not recorded. We don't. Maybe there were some questions. Maybe there was a little bit more discussion as we don't know. We don't know. So we can't infer anything from the silence necessarily. All right, I forgot to. I think I forgot. Let's see, we got Peter and Judas. Okay, yeah, I didn't forget anything. Here we go. I want for us now, like I said earlier, we want to take a quick look back at chapters 5 and 6 and see where we've been. Both of these chapters talk about the polarization that's occurring amongst Jesus' disciples. Both of these chapters follow a similar format. There's a miracle performed or miracles performed, followed by reactions to those miracles, and then Jesus teaches with those miracles in mind as he does so. Chapter 5, where is it taking place? Got the answer on the slide for you. That was an easy one. That's a gimme. That's in Jerusalem, right. What's the miracle of chapter 5? No, not the feeding. Chapter 5.
Healing of the man by the pool.
Healing of the lame man by the pool. He may have been paralyzed. He may have had a deformity. We don't know. But the healing of the lame man by the pool. And this leads up to a confrontation with the Jewish authorities. The Jewish authorities make 2 charges against Jesus. What are those 2 charges?
Healing on the Sabbath.
To do what? Heal on the Sabbath. That's right. That Jesus had, not only had he healed on the Sabbath, but he also told the man, you get up and carry your mat, which is a violation of Sabbath laws in their minds, not in the Torah. It's not a violation of Sabbath law. But in their minds that it was. So the first point was that he had healed on the Sabbath. The second point was calling God his equal, because he said he's my Father. Okay, and so saying he was on the same playing field as God. And so that was a blasphemous idea to the Jews. So Jesus uses this as an opportunity for teaching. And what are the teaching points that Jesus goes through in chapter 5? You remember? First, he talked about the relationship between the Father and the Son. And we boiled that down to 4 points. The actions and the mission of the Father and the Son are the same. They're identical. Secondly, the Son looks to the Father for his direction and for the initiative and the purpose of the mission. Number 3, the Father will give the Son even greater authority than the miraculous powers he has. He will give him the authority over life, and he will also give him authority to judge. Okay, and so that's the third of these things that are brought out. And then the fourth thing is that we are accountable for how we respond to Jesus. Okay, and that's the first part of his teaching. The second part of Jesus' teaching in chapter 5 is all about the various witnesses that testify that Jesus is who he claims to be. And he points out, first of all, that John the Baptist was a witness, but John really was an inadequate witness because he was human. The real witness for Jesus is God himself. And God has witnessed to who Jesus is because of the very works that Jesus does, the miraculous nature of his works, the fact that he is doing these things for the salvation of people, which is the same purpose that God has. Secondly, that the Father had directly testified as to who Jesus was at the time of Jesus' baptism. Thirdly, that the Old Testament had prophesied of Jesus as it spoke of the messianic coming in the kingdom. And then the fourth witness that God used to speak for himself was Moses through the law, and how Moses also spoke of Jesus. So with these messages in mind, where are we left at the end of chapter 5 with this polarization? It's not the end of chapter 5, but in verse 18 we get the answer to that. For this reason, the Jews tried all the harder to kill him. Not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. So in chapter 5, we see in Jerusalem, the seat of the Jews, we see that Jesus has offended them to the point that they are ready to do away with him. Chapter 6 takes place where? Galilee. Good. What miracle do we get now? Feeding of the 5,000, followed by walking on water, calming the storm, showing that he has control over the most powerful forces of this world, the most powerful natural forces of this world. Okay, come on. What are the teaching points that Jesus makes in his discussion in chapter 6? 3 biggies.
True bread from heaven.
I am the bread of life, number 1. That's right. And he develops that, another of those physical, spiritual comparisons when he says, I'm the bread, I'm the life that you need, eat me. Okay? The second point that he makes is that God's plan, God's salvation is coming through Jesus. So we have to come to Jesus in order to see God's plan and accept God's salvation. And then the third point is that Jesus' actual mission is to give his life for the life of the world. Okay? And his followers must ingest that sacrifice also. This, of course, created all the difficulties that we talked about earlier in class today, the difficulties of understanding what Jesus was really talking about, as well as trying to figure out, well, how is this thing going to move forward if he's gone? How does that happen? What's the disposition then in chapter 6 in Galilee? Well, the realization is beginning to dawn that Jesus' notion of the kingdom is very different from theirs. They've got all these preconceived notions. And so the key question that has to be answered in the minds of these believers is, are they going to accept Jesus on his terms, or are they going to continue promoting their own agenda? And that's the question they're going to be wrestling with. And some of them can't take it, and they're going to leave the process. So by the time we get to the end of chapter 6, many have turned back from following him. Verse 66, from this time, many of his disciples turned back and are no longer following him. And this includes at least one in his inmost circle. And then we see on the other hand, though, that some are deepening their faith. And we see Peter as the example of that. And what he says in verses 68 and 69 that we've talked about. Now, let's put chapter 5 and 6 now in the context of where they fall in John's overall narrative. Let me say that again. Let's put 5 and 6 in the context of where John is going overall. Remember, John has said at the end of his gospel, these things are written for a purpose, and they're written so that you might believe. So, what are we learning about faith from chapters 5 and 6? Couldn't hear it. Say it again. Faith in your heart. It's a spiritual thing. It has to take action also. It's not just something we do in our mind, right? It's not something that we can just intellectually accomplish. It's something that our heart has to begin to trust in Jesus and to rely on Jesus. and so that we can walk with Jesus and act as Jesus wants us to act, right? Good. Well, another thing I think we're seeing is that there are as many variations. Lessons about faith. There we go. There are as many variations in faith as there are people. And the reality is, everybody comes with a different set of backgrounds, a different set of scenarios, a different set of needs, different set of situations, and we're seeing this throughout this gospel as you look back to the beginning and the types of things that we've witnessed and seen. And yet through each of them, there's an opportunity for faith to grow. And that's really remarkable. We have seen all kinds of different responses. For some, it results in just open hostility and hatred. For some, it's leading to disgust and disappointment to the point that Judas will betray his master, his leader. Okay? For some, it leaves them passive. They're willing to watch Jesus, but they won't get involved. And boy, doesn't that speak to us today, that level of passivity, right? But then on the other hand, we see as faith sometimes begins to grow that some will at least develop a superficial faith. The problem here is that can fool not only others, but it can fool themselves. That superficial faith where you think, you're content with just getting your foot in the door. Jesus says, no, that's not the way it has to be. You've got to eat my flesh and drink my blood. You're all in or you're not in at all. And then that leads us to the last reaction that we're seeing, which is that of a growing and deepening faith. But the other lesson that we learn of faith in this setting is that it's not instantaneous. It's a process that has to develop and grow. It has to be nurtured. It has to be fed. And sometimes it's fed by being challenged or being tested and surviving that experience. So it's not always easy either, is it? So that's where we've been in chapters 5 and 6. We've arrived at a point where the camps have separated now. And as we move into chapters 7 through 10, which again fall together in a group, chapters 7 through 10, we're going to see this tension growing. On one hand, we're going to have Jesus' mission as set out by God and his purpose. On the other hand, he's got two groups of opponents, and these opponents fall into two classes. There's a group that are opposing him because they have the wrong set of expectations. They have bought into the notion of a Jewish physical kingdom, and Jesus is increasingly showing that that is not what it's all about. And so they're having trouble with that. So that's one group of Jesus' opponents, and they are wrestling with, will I give myself over to his vision and his direction or not? Am I going to continue in my own, with my blinders on, and continue to go the direction I want to go? So that's one group of his opponents. And the other group of his opponents are those who possess all the religious power in first century Palestine. And their goal is to preserve the status quo because they've got a pretty good gig going with all of the money flowing into the temple and all of its activities and all of the intellectual snobbery that they have within their Judaic practices, so that those who are already in control want to stay in control, and they're not about to let this guy from Galilee come in and have their place and have their type of authority. So in chapters 7 through 10, we'll see this focus now shift to Jerusalem almost exclusively. We will see Jerusalem, and we're going to see this conflict being borne out in more and more strident terms. So that's where we will go next week. I would encourage you to spend some time looking at chapter 7 as we'll get into that. And don't forget, God is good.
All the time.
Yes, he is.